Hi guys, and welcome. Here you see a chart with the question category for every single question in Practice Exam 1. And you will be provided a chart like this for every practice exam that you do in the learning phase of my full course, which includes tests 1 through 4. Now this third column here shows the question numbers that fall under each category. So for instance, numbers 3, 12, and 42 are the three parallel structure questions in this exam. So let's say you got number 12 and number 42 incorrect. All you have to do is enter 2 here next to parallel structure. And since you got 2 of the 3 parallel structure questions wrong for this exam, the Excel sheet, which is pre-populated with formulas, will automatically calculate the percent incorrect for parallel structure questions, which is 67%. So first, you go down this list of questions for each category, and then you compare it to the questions you actually answered incorrectly. And lastly, you fill in the rest of this yellow column here in this top chart to auto-generate the graphs you see on the right. The top graph displays the total number incorrect for each question category, while the bottom graph displays the percent incorrect for each question category. In conjunction, these two graphs provide you with valuable visual feedback of your performance. You will do this for each of the 4 exams, tests 1 through 4, and then sum up your statistics from these individual exams and enter the sum into this cumulative chart, which I already demonstrated to you during the demo video. After 198 questions, you will be able to statistically identify your weaknesses with confidence. So I gathered 6 transition questions just from this one practice exam alone, and because it is a very important question type that College Board tests very frequently, we'll start with them here in detail. The first step is to recognize the transition question type. The most common transition questions are the ones that include transitions in the beginning of sentences, as we see in numbers 11, 14, and 20. Sometimes, however, transitions appear before independent clauses located behind semicolons. As we see in number 23 here, those who prized regional foods and Italy's convivial culture feared. That's the independent clause behind the semicolon for number 23 here. And the transition that appears before this independent clause is specifically. In still other questions like number 34, transitions are even more difficult to locate, as although they do appear before independent clauses, which in this sentence is combustion and the resulting fire behave, well, although the transition appears before this independent clause, it appears behind a subordinate or dependent clause. In the microgravity environment of space is the dependent clause in this question, followed by a transition, moreover, and then our independent clause. So, these are the 3 main structures where we may find transitions appear. But the consistency across all transition positioning is that all transitions precede independent clauses. In summary, independent clauses most often start at the beginning of a sentence, but sometimes, like in number 23, start after a mid-sentence semicolon, and other times, like in number 34, start after a dependent clause. Finally, the last type of a transition question is a reversed one that asks you to change the preceding sentence to match a fixed transition in the following sentence. By observing the answer choices of transition questions together, we recognize that all answer choices have variations of transitional phrases except for the occasional reverse transition question type. Like number 39. Once you recognize that you are dealing with a transition question, the rest is very straightforward. You just need to find the relationship between the transition sentence and its preceding one. Does the preceding sentence state an opposing standpoint to the transition sentence? Or does the transition sentence provide an extending statement on the more general context in the preceding sentence? Well, if so, is the extending statement providing specific examples of the preceding sentence's topic? Depending on your answer, refer to this list here to use transitions that extend the preceding statement, specifically extend the preceding statement, or connect a contradictory preceding statement. And since I already went over the logical relationships for each of these questions, I will not do them here, but the questions you see listed in step 2A here is how you recognize and ask appropriate questions to select an effective transition. Subject-verb agreement is the second question type we will analyze for this practice exam, and one that appears quite often in actual exams. Again, the first step is to recognize the subject-verb agreement question type. By analyzing these questions collectively, we see that a verb or several verbs are underlined. Also, in all three questions, prepositional and/or dependent clauses precede the underlined verb portions, as you see in dark blue above for all three questions. In number 19, of professional development is our prepositional phrase, and provided to employees is our dependent past participle phrase that precedes our verb includes. In number 8, that is sent is a dependent clause, and to landfills is a prepositional phrase that precede our verb contribute. In number 37, there's double prepositions that precede our verb causes. In subtle variations and in density are the double prepositions that precede our verb causes. So we clearly see that there's some form of either a prepositional or a dependent clause that precede underlined verb portions in all our subject-verb agreement question types. Lastly, by observing similarities in the answer choices, we can recognize that the choices alternate singular and plural verb forms and/or a variety of verb tenses. In number 19, choices A and B alternate singular and plural forms of our verb include. In number 8, choices A and C alternate singular and plural forms of our verb contribute. And in number 37, choices A, B, and D alternate singular and plural forms of our verbs cause and limit. Other choices, like choices C and D in number 19, B and D in number 8, and choice C in number 37, have different tenses to fill in the rest of the choices. Sometimes, as in the case of number 37, the subject-verb agreement question checks the agreement with the object of a sentence rather than the sentence's main noun. The subtle variations cause and limit, not the sentence noun deformation. Deformation does not cause and limit. The consistency, though, is that prepositional phrases and/or dependent clauses precede the underlined verbs because College Board tries to cloud the subject-verb agreement by getting the noun and the verb as far from each other as possible to make the question more challenging. That is why it is important to reduce non-essential parts of the sentence, which is our next step. Non-essential components to reduce are adjectives, adverbs, prepositional phrases, non-restrictive phrases, which are phrases preceded and followed by commas, and dependent clauses, which are phrases that begin with that, who, whom, whose, which, where, and when. Finally, reread the sentence in its reduced form and determine the proper subject-verb agreement. So applying this for number 19 first, we eliminate the adjectives most and common. The prepositional phrase of professional development is also reduced, and the past participle dependent phrase provided to employees is also reduced. And now the reduced form clarifies the subject-verb agreement and reads, the forms include. For number 8, we reduce the dependent clause that is sent and the prepositional phrase to landfills. Again, the reduced form clarifies the agreement by getting the subject as close to the verb as possible, and it reads organic material contributes. For number 37 now, we need to focus on the predicate because the verbs cause and limit refer to the object variations. So we are only interested in eliminating the non-essential components between variations and causes. Indensity is a prepositional phrase, so we reduce that. That both is a dependent clause, so we reduce that as well. And now we read the reduced form as variations, cause, and limit. Remember, subject-verb agreements do occur most commonly between the sentence noun and the sentence verb, but not always as seen in number 37. To notice that cause and limit refer to variations, you have to ask yourself, what cause and limit the size of the droplets? The answer is variations. Finally, restrictive and non-restrictive clause question types. Restrictive and non-restrictive clause questions require you to determine whether the clause is logically essential to the completeness of a statement. So first thing is to recognize the question type. For restrictive and non-restrictive clause questions, there are often comma or commas in the underlined portion or answer choices. As you see commas in the underlined portions of numbers 22, 24, 40, and 44. Here, 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 and here. In number 27, however, although the underlined portion doesn't contain a comma, its choices provide variations of commas. So either the underlined portions or the choices will contain commas. Also, if you inspect each question's underlined portions, there are dependent clauses, prepositional phrases, and/or subordinate clauses contained in or near the underlined portions. Let's look at number 22. It has the underlined portion followed by the dependent clause, which employees have successfully completed instructional modules and which need to be offered additional training. For number 24, an infinitive introductory phrase to counter the rise of fast food and fast life. is near the underlined portion. Number 27's underlined portion contains the phrase such as altitude and weather. Number 40 contains or microgravity similar to what is experienced in space. And number 44's underlined portion contains prepositional phrases for fighting fires and the other prepositional phrase in space or at future outposts. So all of these questions have some form of prepositional, dependent, or subordinate phrase either as part of the underline or at least near it. Once we recognize the question type, we need to determine whether the phrase or clause is used restrictively or non-restrictively. A phrase or clause is restrictive when it is an essential component of a complete thought. When you remove a restrictive phrase, either 1, the sentence does not make much sense, or 2, the sentence makes a different statement. For example, children at the park are loud. If we remove the phrase at the park, we end up with an entirely different statement, basically saying all children are loud. Restrictive phrases define the scope of the word they modify, which is why removing them results in an entirely different statement. Example 2. Teachers with tenures are protected from emotional decisions. If you remove the phrase with tenures, you end up making an entirely different statement again, that teachers are protected from emotional decisions. That changes the scope and breadth of your original statement to the point where you are now making an entirely different statement and doesn't make much sense either because we just removed a restrictive phrase. Once you determine a phrase as a restrictive phrase, you must remove the commas because they do not need commas. A phrase or clause is non-restrictive when it is not an essential component of a complete thought and just provides extra detail. If the phrase is non-restrictive, the sentence still makes sense without it and makes the same statement even when the phrase is removed because it does not define the scope of the word it modifies, but rather just provides supplementary or extra information. Here's an example. The XYZ movement, which has been active since 1980, has over 3,000 members. We can remove the phrase, which has been active since 1980, and the resulting statement still states the same thing and makes sense. The XYZ movement has over 3,000 members. That makes sense, and therefore, we know this phrase is non-restrictive, for which you need to wrap with commas before and after the phrase. Let's try this exercise for each question. Number 22. When we remove the dependent clause that starts at, which, and ends at, training, the sentence, employers can also identify, doesn't make much sense. Employers can also identify what? Therefore, the which dependent clause is restrictive, and we must remove the comma for restrictive phrases. For number 24, we can remove the introductory infinitive clause without affecting the logic of the sentence. A cohort of chefs, journalists, and sociologists spearheaded a slow food movement, declaring loyalty to unhurried enjoyment. Therefore, the phrase that starts at to and ends at life is a non-restrictive phrase, and all introductory phrases are non-restrictive because they are not part of the main sentence. They just merely set up the main sentence or modify the first noun in the main sentence. Although some very short introductory phrases that are 3 words or fewer are correct with or without a comma, it is never incorrect to follow introductory phrases with a comma because they are non-restrictive. Number 27 now. Removing the phrase such as altitude and weather, that does not affect the completeness of the logic, because a goat ingests the vegetation particular to the meadow in which it grazes, which, along with other environmental factors, shapes the cheese's taste and texture. This reduced sentence still states a complete logical thought without affecting the scope of the original statement, and therefore the phrase such as weather and altitude is non-restrictive and needs to be wrapped by commas. Number 40. Again, let's reread without the phrase that begins at or and ends at space, and see if it makes sense. On the plane's ascent, passengers feel twice Earth's gravitational pull, but for brief periods at the peak of the trajectory, weightlessness is achieved. The thought is still complete without any change in statement scope, and therefore the phrase is non-restrictive and must be wrapped by commas. Finally, number 44. Let's reread without the phrases for fighting fires and in space or at future outposts. Better combustion rate models may even lead to the production of more fuel-efficient engines and improved techniques. Without the prepositional phrase for fighting fires, it sounds like better combustion rate models may even lead to the production of more fuel-efficient engines and improved techniques of all sorts, which makes no sense because combustion rate models specifically lead to improved techniques for fighting fires. But again, that still doesn't make much sense because without the phrase in space or at future outposts, it sounds like these combustion models lead to improved techniques for fighting all sorts of fires, when in fact, the sentence is saying that the combustion models lead to improved techniques for fighting fires specifically in space or at future outposts, not just any fires. Therefore, both prepositional phrases are used restrictively and we must remove the commas. So once we reduce the phrase, reread, and check the logic to distinguish between restrictive and non-restrictive phrases, we must eliminate commas for restrictive ones and insert commas to precede and follow non-restrictive phrases. The exceptions are for phrases and clauses that begin or end a sentence. Introductory phrases are only followed by a comma, since we cannot precede introductory phrases with a comma simply because we don't start a sentence with a comma, but we must still follow it by a comma. And non-restrictive phrases that occur at the end of sentences are only preceded with a comma simply because we do not end sentences with a comma. This is why we do not see commas in front of any introductory phrases like the introductory infinitive phrase in number 24, but introductory phrases are certainly used non-restrictively, and if they were in the middle of the sentence, they would be wrapped by commas as well. Just like if non-restrictive phrases that are at end of sentences, if they appeared in the middle of the sentence, they would also be wrapped by commas as well. Thank you all and see you guys in solution video 2.